Hi, and welcome to Untethered with Jen Liss, the podcast that's here to help you free yourself from the crap that's holding you back so you can claim the life you're meant to live. I'm your host, Jen, and in this episode, we're going to talk about how to transform your life using pleasure. Let's dive in. Hey there, friend. It's Jen. Welcome back to the podcast. This episode, of all the episodes I have done, I have to say, before I interviewed Gina, I was like, ooh, we have never talked about this topic on the podcast. This almost makes me a little uncomfortable. I wonder if it will make my listeners uncomfortable. Pleasure. If you do the pleasure counter in this episode, it's probably said at least 100 times, because that is what Gina Moon is here to do, is to help women reconnect to their pleasure center and to find more joy, to transform their lives, to step into the people who they truly are by leveraging this source, this thing that is in us, this thing that will give us the greatest joy. It's just a beautiful conversation. And I would be so curious to hear on the other side of it, what comes up for you. Gina has been steeped in this work for a long time. She has produced yoga retreats around the world, consulted at Hippocrates Health Institute, created programming for the iconic sacred space, and has held space for hundreds of humans in various transformational containers. She is incredibly immersed in this work and has so much knowledge, both personal and professional, to share about this topic of pleasure. So without further ado, I'm so honored to welcome the beautiful Gina Moon. Hi, Gina.
Hi.
It's so lovely to have you here with us. And I know that you speak about a topic that has not been discussed very much on this podcast. And so I think that you can help to educate us on a few things, and primarily pleasure. That is not a word that has been used very much on this podcast. And yet it's a vital part of life. It's a huge part of life, and this society that we are in, it has certain connotations. And so I think there are people who will shy away from it or not really want to think about it, or we have like a weird conceptions about it.
Right.
So just to kick off the podcast, for anybody who has, looked at your bio, just listened to the intro that I did for you, why is this something that you speak about that you feel like is really vital for people to learn about and embrace?
It's an amazing question. And I have a question for you in return. So when I ask you what you think of pleasure, what comes up?
Sex. First thing, sex.
Yeah. Yeah. What other things? So sex is the first thing. And then what other things bring us pleasure?
The next thing that came up for me was chocolate.
Yes. Usually the number two.
Yeah, I know. I'm so basic. I'm so basic. And then after I got those two out of the way, now that you asked that question, I'm like, the other day I went and I rode on a merry-go-round. That was actually incredibly pleasurable for me. And, just hugging my dog, holding my husband's hand. There's so many little tiny pleasures that I have, eating a delicious salad, so many things that are pleasures.
So a lot of people go right away to sex when we start talking about pleasure. And maybe that's why it's a taboo topic, because they are associated with each other. But we really do receive pleasure from everything in life, right? If we choose to. You could receive pleasure from a salad. I had such a pleasurable experience with my salad today. Right? So it could be really anything. And why is it important? Because pleasure is everything. It's kind of the point of our life is to live in joy and pleasure and to be fulfilled, right? So there's purpose, there's meaning, and then there's pleasure. So if we can get to purpose and meaning while experiencing pleasure, why not? Right. And so my clients come to me because they are disconnected from their pleasure, because they're like, I don't remember the last time I experienced joy or pleasure. And whenever I think of joy versus pleasure, I think of pleasure as a sustained joy, when it's just embodied experience of joy. So joy could be something that's like a momentary thing. And pleasure is something that you just like really deepen with. Like you can deepen with your salad, right? You can just like take every bite, and it could be auditory, it could be, all of our five senses could bring us pleasure. So going into that and living our life from that lens, from that perspective, is that I'm constantly seeking pleasure from everything that I do. It changes so much.
That's a fascinating concept of, I talk about joy a lot. I actually
Mm-hmm.
say to my clients, joy is the strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Huge joy person. What you just said about pleasure being sustained joy, I'm going to do a lot of thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do
And
a
I
lot of
actually,
thinking.
when I said that, I was like, I wonder, I actually want to look up, and I'm surprised that I've never done that. I want to look up the Webster's dictionary, like definition of joy versus pleasure, because I'm curious if it's just my imagination that that's what pleasure is. It's just a deeper level of joy. It's something that you experience and then you continue experiencing it. That's what it feels like to me.
I love it. Whether the
Mm-hmm.
Webster says it's true or not, I don't care. It feels true. And that's what matters, is that it like feels true in my body. I'm like, yeah, that
Yeah.
feels accurate. It feels like I have a knowing about that I maybe had forgotten or ignored or chose not to, or was told not to feel that way. So what do you think keeps people from feeling pleasure, from feeling sustained joy? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, you just finished your sentence with, I was told not to feel that way, right? Or I was taught not to feel that way. So I think it's so many different things and so many different reasons. One is we are not taught to be oriented towards pleasure. And the other thing is we are taught to not be oriented towards pleasure. So it's a little bit of both, right? And so there's all kinds of things that people grow up with of why it's not okay to feel pleasure, why it's not okay to orient towards pleasure, and why it's not okay to make it a priority, right? That you really feel in a consistent state of pleasure. So definitely a sexual connotation is that taboo piece is a big piece for a lot of people. And I have people that ask me, well, what's the point? So yeah, then I experience pleasure, and then what? That's the point. The point is to experience pleasure for pleasure's sake, right? So why are people shying away from feeling it? Because they feel selfish, because they feel self-indulgent, because they feel like, what is the point? Because it's not really something that we as society value deeply. Mm-hmm. Yet it expands us. And, when we talk about expansion, we're like, oh, we want to expand, we want to grow, we want to learn about ourselves, etc. It's really, expansion is pleasure. And I know you and I talked a little bit before the podcast about how sometimes expansion could be not very pleasurable, but most of the time it really is. So your merry-go-round, like imagine that, the wind in your hair, the like feeling that you get on your skin, the breeze, like the perfect sunlight that's hitting you, all of these things, it's kind of like cultivating your joy. So you receive the joy is the gift, and then you just get it like, oh my God, this is so much fun, right? And it's that momentary thing. And then cultivating it and bringing it into your body and making it an embodied experience that you're choosing, that you're sustaining.
It's something that we were discussing. I went off on some tirade before our podcast began about growth and about it being summer solstice as we are recording this podcast episode. And so, the plants are just going wild right now. And with growth does come discomfort. There's also pleasure. So there's two sides of the coin. And is it that people were so conditioned to focus on the discomfort part of it instead of focusing on the pleasure, because they're both existing? I always have to think, even plants, like there has to be some discomfort in how fast this plant is growing this time of year. You know what I mean?
Right. So discomfort, believe it or not, can also be pleasurable if we choose to do that. If you choose to sit with it and say, wow, like this is really uncomfortable. Like, how do I turn that into pleasure? How do I turn that into something that I can kind of transmute and alchemize into the next level of my being? I am becoming something else. How? So everything is practice, and there are infinite pleasure practices, and there are infinite ancient and modern, and from every tradition there are pleasure practices all around, right? And there's practices, of course, with how we sit with our discomfort and make it okay, normalize it first, then you can, go into pleasure, because the first step would be to say, like, okay, this is really uncomfortable, like, let me just sit with that and be okay with it, and not go write an email or go wash my dishes or run away from it in every possible way that I can, right? And then as we get to know it, as we sit with it, we could say, like, okay, so a bunch of different questions, right? So how is this feeding me? How is this making me better? How is this taking me to the next level? How has it served me? How has this discomfort, this really, big block, or this challenge, this obstacle, how has it served me? How am I growing out of it? Like, there's so many different ways that we can approach it, where you could, like, really be like, okay, even going through, like, what's the worst thing that could happen here with this discomfort, right? So the discomfort is, my girlfriend will break up with me. I just really feel it. I feel it. She's just not here. She hasn't been paying attention to me. And going through all of the motions of, like, okay, so she's going to come to me tonight and she's going to tell me that she's breaking up with me. And then she's going to leave and she's going to take all her things with her. What is that like? Like, what is the worst thing that could happen? And getting to the root of the discomfort, getting to the root of, like, that incredible amount of pain, it can explode in pleasure.
This is fascinating.
Let's try it.
Yeah,
Right?
I love that idea. One of the things that I'll just share for the listeners and for you in my own journey is that I came to a realization that I was more uncomfortable with discomfort than I was with pleasure. And when I felt pleasure, it felt bad. So there was that two-sided thing that when we feel pleasure, we feel like bad people. Do you see this often with people, that this is a narrative?
Right. Well, that goes back to, like, feeling selfish, feeling self-involved, feeling self-indulgent, right? When you indulge, pleasure, indulgence, they also go a little bit together, right? Feeling irresponsible. I hear a lot of people being like, well, that's irresponsible, right? That's selfish. What is the point? That's a really big one for a lot of people. But, like, why would I want to do that? Why do I want to cultivate pleasure? Why do I want to feel good? So that question sounds different. Like, why do I want to feel good? Why is that even a question for us? That, to me, is a question. Why is that even a question? Why do I want to feel good? Because it feels good to feel good. Because when you feel good, then you're able to, depending on, who you are surrounded with, you are able to bring that to the people, right? Bring it to your environment, to your loved ones, to your children, to your pets, right? And you light up the world with your pleasure. You light the world up with your joy, with you feeling good. When you meet someone that is a joyful being, that is someone that's oriented towards pleasure, your interaction with them is going to be very different than someone who's like, I am a responsible human being on this planet. And that is really my whole mission, is to be responsible. That's not fun.
Yeah, I think I made it in the first half of my life, probably more than the first half, to knock people down that were in a state of joy because I didn't understand it. I was like, how could you possibly feel so joyful? Come back down, where all of us practical people are being practical and responsible and thinking about all the negative things that could possibly happen. And that's where I think a lot of the world is currently living. I'm curious, what brought you to this point? Let's back up. What was your experience that brought you here? That's what brought me to this point, is kind of this trajectory of exploring some of these questions. Like, wait a second, why am I behaving this way? And seeing through different eyes. What got you to this?
I will lovingly answer that. And I'm really curious, where did you feel that shift? At what point was it like, oh, I don't really want to be just responsible and practical. I actually want to enjoy life?
It was we're really getting to the core of my giant switch. I was on a hike and I was listening to
Ah.
a coaching call, and I had this, which was actually an act of pleasure for me. I wasn't able to attend the call. And so I said, you know what? Since I can't attend, I'm going to listen to the replay on a hike because that brings me joy.
Mm.
So this was a joy decision that had led me to this moment where on the hike, I'm listening to something somebody said, and I had this download. I'm more uncomfortable with being, or I'm more comfortable with being uncomfortable than experiencing joy. That was the switch. That was my switch.
Oof.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened? And after that, what were the next steps?
I began to experience joy more often. I started to
Mm.
play with, there's something that I do called joy expansion where I feel, which I think is pleasure expansion, perhaps from your perspective. I feel it in my body. I feel a sense of joy and I grow it. I somatically expand that joy. That doing that practice changed my life, changed everything. Yeah.
Yeah, because when you came on the call, if I could name how you were very joyful.
Yeah.
So I think it's just that we start prioritizing joy, we start prioritizing pleasure, we start prioritizing feeling good. And can you be practical and feel good simultaneously? Have you managed that? Have you accomplished being practical and feeling good simultaneously?
I don't think my joyful side is very practical at all.
Yeah, but it's like you still now you live your life with joy and pleasure, and somehow you still manage your life. Like
I see
things
what
did
you're
not
saying.
fall by the wayside. Like it wasn't like, okay, like now my life fell apart. I'm joyful all the time, but nothing else works, right? It's like everything still works out. You're still going to do your work. You're still going to feed your children.
Even
You're
better,
still
actually.
Probably, most likely, I would say for sure better. So back to how I got here. I think that I've always been oriented towards pleasure. I've always been really oriented towards connection. So that's my highest value and my highest talent in life is connection. And connection brings me incredible amounts of joy and pleasure. And both, right? Joy in like, oh my God, it's so nice to see you and it's so nice to connect and it's in that moment. And then like almost I'm thinking again of joy and pleasure and distinguishing between those two is like meeting you and being so excited by who you are and just like you being so open and so loving and so present and fun. And I knew that we could like talk for 3 hours and then going deeper into that conversation and like that depth when you're like really hearing someone's story, really getting to know them, really feeling their heart, really feeling that like common humanity. There's so much pleasure in that for me. And that's always been the case. So I've always been oriented towards pleasure. I've always been oriented towards joy. But how I started with this work is I've worked with people in one capacity or another for so many years. And this is the thing that I really wanted to bring to people is the somatic practices of bringing pleasure into your body, being an embodied feminine, because I do work with feminine essence and I do work with polarity paradigms, being an embodied, pleasure filled feminine being. What is that like?
Do you feel like you have just always been this way? So I have to believe that you're a gift that has been brought to this world to help other people to bring this out in themselves. Have you felt different? Have you felt different because of that? Or have you just always felt so confident in exactly who you are? I'm curious, and I have to wonder if other listeners are curious too. She's so confident in that. Yeah.
Definitely both. I also am a Scorpio. So it's kind of my birthright, right? To do the whole like sexy kitten, death and rebirth, Pluto, underworld, you know, confident, sexy vibes. Yeah. And of course, you know, you go to high school and when you show up the way that I show up, it's not always, you know, acceptable or welcome, right? So both definitely felt very different and very alone in many different points in my life. And that hasn't changed really how I show up. And I think as we get older, it gets easier because you start giving a lot less fucks, right? Because you're like, okay, you don't like it. God bless you. Like, that's amazing that you don't like it. Go find the thing that brings you pleasure and do that. And if it's being responsible, then enjoy being responsible. Enjoy being practical. How much pleasure can you get from being practical? Like, can you embody that? Then do that. Right. So there's different paths for how to get there.
Yeah.
And I started getting deeper and deeper into these practices. And so ecstasy and pleasure has been considered a transformational force, a transformational, transmutational force by so many ancient traditions, right? And I feel like we are now in a place in the world where we're getting more and more of this conversation. It becomes more and more mainstream. Like, I don't think I've heard about sex magic 10 years ago. And now I know you're familiar with the word, with that term, because it's becoming more and more mainstream, right? And I think people are more and more curious about it, as we are getting curious about, let's say, like the Joe Dispenza and meditating our way to all of the transformation that we desire, right? Then I feel like that's the next thing, is how do we use embodied pleasure for the transformation that we desire? Because in meditation, our magnetic field expands, right? So we are able to actually materialize or manifest, magnetize things more easily. And when we are in pleasure, and if it's sexual pleasure or any other expansive way of being, we are expanding our magnetic field. So in that way, it really is like science. Like Joe Dispenza is incredible because he really brought this woo stuff into the most incredible scientific way for us to interpret and to be with. And I think that pleasure and sexuality and sex magic and everything that has to do with expansion through pleasure and sexuality is the next wave of that. When we figure out, oh, we can actually masturbate our way to magnetizing everything that we want, or we can meditate our way to magnetizing everything that we want, because they actually have the same physical magnetic expression.
It's the three M's. You can masturbate, meditate, and magnetize.
I love it. Did you just come up with that?
I just came up with that.
Oh my God.
It's fascinating what you're saying there, though. So I love Dr. Joe. I've done his meditations. I regularly do them. For anybody who's listening, he's been mentioned on the podcast before, but you can go look him up. He is very into transforming, magnetizing your field, getting the things that you want. He does a lot of visualization, and it's very much based in science. He's done so much science. He's currently doing a lot of cancer research on how meditation can improve your life, can shift things physically in your body. And it's genuinely so fascinating. If you want to read the book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, it's a really, really great one. What you're hitting on is something that I have found for myself, for my clients. It's both. Like, it's the three M's. What you're saying here, it's the mind and it's the body, because it's gotta be both. We're whole beings. And if we are indeed a soul or some kind of presence who is here having this human experience, then the mind is a piece of it. Connecting to other realms or otherness is a piece of it, but there's this present experience that we are having. Like, the body itself is transforming things, is alchemizing things, is moving energy. Like, this body that we're living in, it is energy and it's processing energy. We're all part of that. So it feels like it's both. So I love what you're saying here. Do you feel that way, though? I don't want to assume what you're saying.
100%, of course. Yeah, because you can know something in concept, but until you've really moved it through the body and you have an embodied experience of it, it's just a concept, right? So there is like knowing, oh, I know this. And then there is the knowing, like, you really know this. You live it, like you've experienced it. It's part of who you are. And that only comes, it doesn't come from the mind. It can't be a cerebral thing. It has to be an embodied thing. And that's why I love that word embodied. Like, it's really like that feeling, like how we can move energy through our body. We can't move energy like that through our mind alone, right?
Yeah.
And that's why, like, back to Dr. Joe, like, what I love beyond all of the incredible things that he's doing, it's for people who are skeptical and they're like, oh, meditation, great, whatever, right? Like, he's actually connecting neurons to people's brains, and he's showing how our brain chemistry changes, our body chemistry changes. And it doesn't just change in the moment, it changes completely. Like, our neurotransmitters change, our neuropathways change, and it's a permanent change. And it's absolutely incredible that we get to witness that. And we're like, oh, okay, this is science now.
Genuinely, we're living in such a cool time for all of this because of the research. And he's one of those pioneers who is making it mainstream by connecting those dots for us, of us seeing. And our cognitive minds love that confirmation of science. Like, this is science. Like, look at this. We need to sometimes see the thing to believe the thing. And part of what you're saying is that if you feel the thing, then you just know. But in some ways, we have become untrusting of that knowing in our bodies. Like, we don't trust that knowing. We've disconnected from that knowing. Any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I think that we are very disconnected from our bodies. That's the thoughts. Like, it's always, we go to the gym so we can look good or, be healthy, right? I don't think that we move our body for the purpose of, like, connecting mind, body, spirit, right? Because we all so often, like, we think one thing and we say another thing and we act the third way, and our body is wanting to do an entirely different thing, right? So that way of being disconnected, like, I'm trying to remember that quote that in ancient cultures. Are you familiar with who Gabrielle Roth is? She's the founder of Five Rhythms.
Yes.
It's yes. Okay. So it's it's a non-choreographed guided dance movement practice that was founded in the 60s by this woman, Gabrielle Roth, who was absolutely brilliant. And she talked about how our bodies move in different rhythms. There's 5 different rhythms, and we need all 5 rhythms. So it's I'm not going to get too into it, but she says that in any ancient culture, when you come and you say that you're sad or disillusioned or depressed, they ask you 3 questions. Have you been dancing? Have you been singing? And have you been telling stories? Right? And I think that it's all of these things are coming to the surface. And I think that the 4th thing is, like, have you been making love, wildly, untamed, in a really like full, fulfilling, untethered way, right? So I know that we're getting really into storytelling, that everyone is, like, about storytelling nowadays. And hopefully we are going to be more about movement and somatic movement. And that also is becoming more mainstream, and we're talking about it more, right? And singing, like, our throat chakra, like, that's our truth. That's our purpose. That's everything that we bring into the world is this way, right? So opening all of these channels of the body, and not just, like, okay, thinking, typing, right? There's so many different ways for us to express.
What's so great about storytelling is that it makes us feel. So you tell a story and it makes you feel something. That's why we are so connected via a story, and the same with dancing. So these things they're all ways of helping us to embody. And that's what, all religions throughout time have these similar things that help us to do exactly what you do with your work and what you're so passionate about. It's so cool. What do you feel like what drives you with this? Like, what do you feel like is at stake with us not feeling pleasure, with us not being connected to our bodies and, knowing?
Thank you for asking that. So what's at stake? That's a really big question, but I just see how radical of a difference this makes in women's lives when we start doing these practices, when we start creating the framework that's different than what we are used to, right? Like pleasure versus, like, you're selfish and you are irresponsible. And I don't like to say success stories, but I have the most incredible stories from like women going from, brink of divorce, just absolutely like deeply, deeply unhappy for so many years and unable to even admit it to herself, to 4 months later, which is like nothing. What is 4 months? Nothing.
A blip.
Exactly. Saying, like, the other day I had a conversation with her and she said, like, I really cannot believe these words are coming out of my mouth, but my relationship is better than it has ever been. Like, I'm getting chills. My marriage is better than it has ever been. And I thought that there is not a thing in the world that can save it. So when women go back to really cultivating their feminine, cultivating their pleasure, and focusing on that and doing these practices, everything changes.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah, and we are, of course, we are both masculine and feminine, but I think that we're also used to the efforting, right? Like, we can't get anything unless we effort for it. And changing that paradigm, like that, exactly that framework of like, what if you didn't have to effort? What if you had to work internally in like very specific ways to cultivate your feminine essence? Because the feminine is receptivity. The purpose, the point, the entitlement of the feminine is to receive, where you get to receive.
I think that there's a lot more discussion about the masculine and the feminine. For anyone who wants to do more research on that, I'm sure that you have so much information yourself that you share in your programs about it. You can do some Google searching about it as well. And really just to think, like, how much am I efforting? How much am I receiving? Because that can be a good gauge of like, is there a little bit of shifting that I could do internally in order to welcome more of one than the other? So thank you so much for sharing about that topic.
And we have a hard time receiving, right? Don't we have a hard time receiving in general as a society? That's why we, and I spoke to someone about it the other day where we're like, oh, wow, beautiful dress, right? Oh, this old thing, right? That kind of cliche thing, like there's a reason why we're like, no, thank you, right? That we can't receive that nourishment. So there's this piece about like, how do we actually cultivate our container to receive more? Why don't we think that we deserve to receive everything and more just for being ourselves? Like, why do we feel like our value and our ability to receive is only equivalent with like how much effort we make or how responsible we are? Like, who taught us that? Where are these paradigms and like these concepts? Where are they coming from? I'm not really sure, but we believe them.
Yeah. If somebody is like, okay, I have trouble receiving a compliment. Yes, this is something I can very much relate to. Do you happen to have one little tiny thing, that a little shift that they could make, a question they could ask themselves, something that they could do to help them to open up to receiving a little bit more?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love this practice where you can write to 5 of your favorite friends. And you could say, what are your favorite things about me? You could say, like, what are 5 things that you really love and admire about me? Yeah. And you can journal on, like, I love this about myself. What are the things? Let's practice together. So I'll ask you 2 questions. One is going to be, what are you absolutely amazing at? And the other one is, what is it that you absolutely adore, love about yourself?
Hey, what am I absolutely amazing at? Holding judgment-free space for other people. Used to be a hairstylist and as a coach, like that's a thread. What was the second question? In love with?
What do you love about yourself?
I love that joy is really easy for me. It's very easy. It's my natural essence. I love that. I would not have said that a few years ago. I say that now.
So you love that joy is your natural essence.
Mm-hmm.
I love that too. And I could definitely see the transition from being a hairstylist to being a coach. That's perfect. You're already like, people are like, oh, she's my shrink, right? As a hairstylist. Yeah. So that would be my first thing. Like, if you have a hard time receiving a compliment, if you notice this about yourself, go out there and seek out 5 compliments. Not 5 compliments, 5 series of compliments. Right. And I would do that with a friend more than like a lover or a husband, because there's a very different expectation There's a different amount of charge. So I would do it with friends who are as charge free as possible. So someone that you don't have a weird dynamic with, someone that you really just is at ease with as much as possible.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
a beautiful
And
exercise.
so when you do that, when you receive these compliments, really embody them. So like sit with what you are receiving. So let's say Jen, I saw you and I was like, wow, she's so incredibly open, right? Like you are not, yeah, you don't have walls. You're very open, right? And yes, you're very joyful and you're very playful, right? So when you read these compliments, these reflections, not compliments, they're reflections, really allow them to permeate your entire body, right? So like, I am, I don't know, joyful, let's say, right? I'm joyful and really feel it everywhere. Like feel it in your solar plexus, feel it in your heart, feel it in your head. I am joyful and really allow it to permeate. So when you do that, you really actually expand your capacity to receive. And anytime that you receive anything, really practice as hard as it is to say thank you and be in that process, in the process of receiving.
Transformative. This, you just offered such a mic drop gift to this audience. Thank you for offering that. I encourage every listener, go reach out to 5 non-charged people, less charged as possible people, ask them for those 5 beautiful things and allow yourself to feel them. One thing, I'm just going to give one caveat because I know that this can come up for people. If you notice some resistance, here's what I would say, and then I'll ask you for your thought.
Yeah.
If you notice some resistance, allow it to be there. You don't need to push it away. Like notice, oh, this is actually kind of hard for me to feel. You don't have to be mad at yourself because you can't feel the joy from it. Just allow that to be there and try again. And just allow it yourself to feel it as much as you possibly can. As you practice it, you'll feel it more. Do you agree with that, or do you have any other
100%. Yeah. There's a lot. We can talk for 6 hours about receiving and why why it's difficult for us to receive, right? And a lot of times it's because it hasn't been safe, right? So if you feel a resistance and you're like, I don't want this, possibly it's because it doesn't feel safe. And that's another exploration, of course. But yeah, absolutely no judgment. If it's hard to receive, it's hard, I think, for majority of people to receive.
So
and
normal.
I would say that it's hard for majority of women to receive. We're so good at giving. We're so good at it. We're so generous. We're so like, here's everything, right? But when it comes to receiving, that's I think an edge for majority of us.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Thank you for talking so openly about this. I have 2 more questions for you. One, I'm so curious for you because something I've noticed in interviewing so many people, it's like we can move forward so far. And you talk about this topic that you said it yourself, is taboo. And a lot of people might be thinking, wow, I mean, easy for her to go out there and have something called the pleasure portal and be helping people. But maybe they're feeling that call to like, I could be stepping outside of my box a little bit more. And it seems like everybody, no matter how far they've come, how easy something is for them, they still have their tethers, like their things that they have to work through. So I'm so curious for you. Do you have any particular thing that tends to stop you? Some tether that seems you get caught up in some kind of web about something?
Yeah, I get caught up in that in the same tether, in the same web of like, oh, well, I was just, I had a really amazing group program and I had my sex magic practice planned for our 6th week. And I was like, oh, you know what? Why don't we just do something else and, do a different practice on 6th week and do that next week? I waited until week 10 because there is a part of me that's like, how is this going to be received? Right? So there's definitely like this big desire and this big mission to bring it to people because I know it works. Right. And when I work with people one-on-one, like, okay, that's a different thing. So this is an edge already for me to bring it to a container of women, right? More than one. and how is it going to be received. It's still bringing this work to people. There is an edge to it no matter what, right? Because everyone has a history, everyone has a very specific relationship with pleasure, with sex, with sexuality, with their body, with safety, with trauma, with, everything, right? So it's such a delicate thing. It's such a meaningful and important thing, and it's such a delicate thing.
Yeah. Thank you for being honest about that. I think it helps to hear that we're all human and we're all facing those edges. And your congratulations to you for continuing to be courageous. And what drives you? What drives you to keep pushing with that, even though it's hard sometimes?
Because first of all, I see the results. Second of all, I love it. I could talk about this like I could wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then for 12 hours until 7 p.m., I could talk about all of these things that we're like, touching upon, right? It changed my life. So when I came up with this program, it was in the middle of the night that I was like, and I just jumped up in the middle of the night and I journaled for like 2 hours, and I had this whole program planned out. And the next day I went and I got a tattoo that says Pleasure Portal, because I really wanted to be committed to it forever. So I got it on my body to be committed to it in case I just change my mind tomorrow and I decide to be like a career coach or something else, right? So I could live on that edge and explore that edge all the time. And I really do see the profound, like radical and rapid difference that this work makes for people. And I see it in my life as well. So we say this and we laugh, my partner and I, that this is objectively the best relationship we've ever been in, because it's objectively the best version of ourselves that we've ever been in. And before this incredible, like every day I'm like, wow, like how is this even possible? Like if I could create like the best version of a partnership, it would still exceed my highest expectations. And I really think that it was because I cultivated my feminine qualities and I cultivated patience and understanding and all of these different things, and have a foundational piece about how do I want to show up in a relationship? How do I communicate in a relationship? What language we use? What agreements we make? What are our non-negotiables? What are all of these different pieces that it allowed us to actually experience our wildest dreams of a partnership together. And before this, I was in a really wonderful relationship as well, but it was constantly on the verge of falling apart. Like every day it could end. It was just like one tiny little thread away from falling apart all the time. And living in that for, close to 6 years, where your nervous system is completely dysregulated, I really wanted to find something that, would be, what's the word I'm looking for? Be like proof is in the pudding, kind of something that I can do, something that I can grow from to a degree where my life completely reflects what I believe, right? So now I get to be the shining example of my ideal partnership, and I get to bring 100% of that into my partnership and have it be reflected because I know what it is.
Oh, wonderful. I love that you have been able to cultivate this for yourself, and that you're reaping the rewards of the work that you have done for yourself, and also the work that you've done for the world, because it's a reflection of who you are. And it's just so wonderful. Okay, final question. I ask every guest this. Gina, where do you see the magic in the world?
Everywhere. Does everyone say that?
Some people do, but usually then something else comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really do see it everywhere though. I'm one of those annoying people that's like, oh, look at the moon. Look at this flower, right? So I think that you and I have a feeling we have that in common, where there's just this really large perception of how incredible everything is. Like I have these flowers behind me, these peonies that I absolutely adore. And I cannot tell you how much joy, how much pleasure they have brought me over the week now. They're like dying. And I have a practice with flowers that are dying. That's a very feminine practice, but how much joy they have brought me. And now they're going to bring me more pleasure while they're dying.
What will you do with them as they
I will do
I
a
ask?
really, of course, I will do a really beautiful ritual. Actually, what we can do is I will gift your listeners this meditation that we do. It's a rose garden meditation where we walk through a rose garden and we have a different relationship with roses that are just blooming and roses that are mature and roses that are dying.
What a beautiful
That's all I'll
gift.
say for now, but it's super fun, this meditation. People love this meditation.
Thank you so much.
It's a good tearjerker.
Ah, so lovely. Thank you so much for that gift. I'm so this question, I love it because it opens up conversation to something that otherwise wouldn't be. We would not have talked about those flowers if it hadn't been. So thank you so much for that gift. That will be in the show notes, as well as all links to Gina. You can go to her website, you can follow her on social media, and you can go to her page for the Pleasure Portal. So that is all there. Go check her out. Go follow her. Gina, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Jen, it was such a pleasure being here. Truly. It was such a joy. Thank you.
I so hope you got some pleasure out of that episode and meeting Gina and hearing what she had to say. If nothing else, I hope you got some amazing food for thought for yourself. And did any of the topics that we talked about, did any of it make you feel triggered, uncomfortable? Did you feel just so open and receptive to all of it? Were you like pumping your fist? Yes. Like, how were you feeling during this episode? Because this is a topic that we have not talked about, female embodiment, the embodiment of the feminine versus the masculine on this podcast very much. And yet it is a lot of what holds people back. We can be very tethered by not allowing ourselves to experience joy and to experience pleasure. So think about this. Are you experiencing your greatest joy? Are you letting that joy extend beyond the current experience? Or are you deflecting compliments? Please partake in that exercise that Gina suggested that you do, because it will transform your life. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you liked it, if there was something that really hit with you, share it with a friend or take a little screenshot and share this episode on social media. If you tag me at UntetheredJen on Instagram, I will always reshare your posts. Another thing that you can do to help grow this podcast is to leave a review. You can go on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and leave a review of the podcast. It really helps get this podcast into more listening ears. Thank you again so much for listening. You just keep shining your magical unicorn light out there for all to see. I'll see you next time. Bye.